what's amazing to me also is the Federal Reserve, blessed by Congress, shot an absolute money cannon in 2020. Right out of the gate, you had them buying up assets, bonds. I mean, a ton of money to Wall Street and corporations. But now, and the people got some crumbs. What was it, a $1,200 check at the time, an additional $1,400 check, unemployment. But now Jerome Powell is saying the way around all of this, which you're pointing out, is predominantly price gouging. We got to get wages down. That's what the Federal Reserve chair is saying. We got to get wages down. You got Larry Summers, who should be in a witness protection program, politically speaking. He's saying we need to get unemployment up. It's just kind of insane to me. I mean, you don't have to be an economic wizard here. They get very creative when it comes to saving Wall Street. But when the people have high gas prices, high food prices, electricity, rent, you name it. Biden is proposing a gas tax holiday, which will give people an average of, $3.50 for a 20-gallon tank. What are your thoughts on? It just seems there's a discrepancy between what we could do when Wall Street's in trouble versus Main Street.
Well, we live in a society which, I really mean this, and I have not thought this until the last year or so. We live in a society which, in my opinion, is a declining empire. We've lost the last three wars, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. You could also throw in Libya and a couple others if you want. But we are falling apart internationally. We are facing, for the first time in 100 years, a serious economic competitor. The only thing close to a competitor in the 20th century was Germany and Japan. They were defeated in the two world wars. There was no other competitor. Russia never was an economic competitor of the United States, and it isn't one now. Only in the wildly overstimulated political imagination of the American people is there any other truth. Let me give you just one statistic because it'll drive it home. What is the GDP, the gross domestic product? That's a number economists like us use to give you a rough idea of how big an economy is. What's the total value of the output of goods and services that an economy accomplishes in a year? The answer for Russia today is $1.5 trillion. What is the GDP of the United States, the adversary of Russia, for example, in the Ukraine right now? Answer: the GDP of the United States is now larger than $21 trillion. In other words, there is no comparison. One is David and the other one is Goliath. And if you don't like those biblical examples, make up your own. China's GDP is about $15 trillion. In other words, China is a giant relative to Russia, just like the United States is. You have to keep that in mind, or else you will believe the kind of nonsense that you just quoted. The rate of increase of prices, according to the U.S. government now, 8.6% per year. The rate of increase of wages in this country by the same U.S. government right now, about 4.5%. So this is not an inflation driven by wages. What we have is a system of prices going up at roughly twice the rate of wages, which means that only a worker who's getting a raise of over 8.5%, and let me tell you, that's not even 5 or 10% of our labor force. Only that is keeping up. Everybody else is falling behind. You are ripping off the American majority and the American working class by the inflation. And this comes after 2 years in which we had the worst failure of our society to cope with a public health disaster, and the second worst economic collapse, second only to the Great Depression of the 1930s. You've put the American working class through the ringer in 2020. We never had a public health disaster and an economic crash of capitalism at the same time. This is unprecedented what you've done. And now, after 2 years, you whack your people across the face with an inflation, and you have the nerve to say, well, you know how we're going to deal with this inflation, having blown everything else out of the box? We're going to have more unemployment for lots of you. I mean, if ever I saw a society marching right into its own self-destruction, it's this one right now. And the lunacy of how this inflation is talked about. You know, one more example. In the United Kingdom, which is a society even further along in self-destruction than we are, because they lost their empire 100 years ago. We only lost ours in the last 20 years. And they've had to struggle with it for a century. Even there, with a government that's hanging on by its fingernails, they have a Trump-like clown named Boris Johnson, who literally partied his way through the pandemic, which was bad enough, and then got caught doing it, which gives you an idea of what competence there is over there. Even he has imposed on the British oil companies a special government tax on the extraordinary profits they're making because of the high prices they have jacked up for oil in their country. Here in the United States, our president, who's allied with Mr. Johnson, doesn't say a word, has no proposal to tax any oil company, anything. He kind of asks them if they would please not raise the prices, maybe quite so much, bring them down just a little. The rest of the world watches all of this, scratches his head, and says, this is an economy going down.
Well, if your heart could take it, I want to show a clip from Jim Cramer on CNBC, because Jim Cramer on CNBC, wrong about most everything in the economy, was very offended by Biden's very ginger letter to the oil executives. Yeah. Let's play that, Colin.
Secretary Granholm is going to sit down with the big refining and oil companies, hoping to come up with some sort of compromise. Yep. And my prediction is no chance whatsoever that, even though that the oil companies are never acknowledged for what they've done, which has become much more green, they're always considered to be ne'er-do-wells because they're not using the leases that they bought.
He went on to say that Biden was double speaking and basically should be nicer to the oil companies. I don't know. I wasn't alive, but JFK in 1962, when the steel companies colluded to fix prices, he held a press conference, called them out, not tepidly, strongly, and then threatened to take away their contracts, particularly submarine contracts, and U.S. Steel give those contracts to steel companies that were not increasing prices, and U.S. Steel and other steel companies folded like a cheap tent. Yeah. I don't know. The United States government gives these oil companies $15 billion annually in subsidies. It seems that could be dangled as a threat, but that's
there's no end, George. There's no end of threats. I could prepare you. Give me a half an hour. I'll come up with a list of 25. Any other economist could do it too, worth his or her salt, and there are plenty of them, and they could give you a list. This is not a technical problem. This is a political problem. End of conversation. Mr. Biden is in the soup for his the elections coming up in November. He's afraid of doing anything, so he does nothing. Let me remind your audience of American history that has been conveniently forgotten. When we had a bad inflation back in 1970-71, we then had a conservative Republican president, Richard M. Nixon. He went on radio and television August 15th of the year 1971. And here's what he said to the American people and to the employers, who are the ones who set prices. He knew there was a bad inflation then, worse even than what we have now. He knew he had to get it under control, but he also understood what his powers as president were and what they were not. So here's what he said, just so you understand what a political commitment could look like. He announces very quietly, it's an evening speech. He says, as of tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, I'm hereby informing you, if you are the owner or the employer of a business, if you raise your prices for anything, you're going to be arrested and I'm going to throw you in jail. And if you're a union or a worker and you press for higher wages, I'm going to do the same. It was called a price wage freeze, which is literally what it was. The inflation stopped on a dime. It was originally scheduled to go for 90 days. It went longer. By the way, are there problems with price wage freezes? Yes, there are. There are problems with every policy that you could come up with. There sure as hell are loads of problems with doing nothing or with doing the kind of namby-pamby stuff that Mr. Biden's doing. But the idea that we don't know how to stop an inflation, our own history is full of examples. I could give you many more, and I'm happy to if you want me to. But I picked Mr. Nixon because he's a conservative Republican, and that's what he did to stop an inflation. And the thing you have to think about with me is, how is it possible that we're struggling with an inflation now, and we don't even open up the possibility of a price wage freeze? This country has moved so close to the edge of self-destruction, it can't even search through its own history to figure out what worked in the past. How could we maybe use it? Have a discussion? No. We are so far right-wing that we don't discuss anything that makes us uncomfortable. And so we are going down the tube. It's an amazing thing to watch. And as it accumulates momentum, it's going to be very hard to stop.
And, you touched on it earlier. I'm not shocked, but basically I was shocked that this didn't get more media attention. A couple of months ago, Elizabeth Warren, not a huge fan of her, but at least she got this out of the Federal Reserve Chair. She was in a hearing with Jerome Powell. And she basically got Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Chair, to admit what really is going on here with inflation. Colin, if we could play it.
Because we're still kind of doing Econ 101 here. If you're a corporation that has eaten up most of the competition and cornered the market, is it easier for you to raise prices on your customers and maximize your profits because you don't have to worry about losing your business? In other words, you've lost the discipline that the market imposes.
In principle, if you don't have competition and you're a monopolist, yes, you can raise your prices.
Okay. Today, nearly 2 out of 3 of the biggest publicly traded corporations in the country are reporting fatter profit margins than they reported before the pandemic. Does that increase in profit margins, combined with greater market concentration in industry after industry, suggest to you that some corporations may be passing along increased costs and at the same time charging more on top of that to fatten their profit margins?
That could be right. It could also just be, though, that demand is incredibly strong and that they're raising prices because they can.
Well, that's the point. They're raising prices because they can, and they're not being competed down.
Jordan, if I could just comment.
Yeah.
Because here again, Mr. Powell, either he deserves an F in economics. If I were his teacher and I heard him talk like that, I'd have him come to my office. I wouldn't give him an F because an F doesn't tell you anything more than you failed. I would want to explain to him as a student what it is that's nonsense in his speech. Okay, let's talk about, because you hear it all the time. The demand has increased. Okay, let's go through a very quick exercise. Suppose you're a business, any business, and you're aware that out there in the world among the customers, there's a growing demand. People have the money and the desire, and they're coming to buy. Okay, what you know and what Elizabeth Warren is there pulling in his teeth with is that enables you to raise your price. Why would you do that? Because it's a quick way to make money. Are you required to do it? Of course not. Is there any gun being held to your head? Says, okay, there's a lot of demand, raise the price. Not at all. Here's a second option. Instead of raising the price when you see an excess of demand coming, you order more production. You know, that's the whole point. That would create jobs for people to produce the extra stuff that you would produce and sell to the demand that's there. Every capitalist employer confronting rising demand has a choice to make. Are you going to respond to the rising demand by selling more goods at the same price, or not sell more goods, instead jack up the price? It's your choice, and therefore it's your responsibility. Every one of the companies that is facing rising demand, every one of them, could have, should have, might have, and in other circumstances has in fact responded by producing more. And now would be the time, when we still haven't recovered the amount of percentage of our people working in a job that we had before the pandemic. We need people to have good jobs. We certainly don't need an inflation. And what do our employers give us? They don't give us the exploding job market. What they give us is the inflation nobody else but them wants. And now they want to blame, like Mr. Powell, blame demand, or blame a supply chain disruption, or blame Mr. Putin. It has about the equal value in terms of anything approaching an honest analysis.